So my talk for 5 minutes is about sexual assault, and taking the example of what happened in India on December 16th. With all of you probably know the rape of a young woman. So this is a slide about the protesters that were being water cannoned by the police in Delhi, and it is where literally the seat of power is. And the word I've used there is called Azadi, which means freedom. And it was a popular activist slogan during that time. But was this movement a movement for transformational change? And I question that. How long did it last, and for who did it last? And I think I want to read out Robert Gass's definition, where he says, transformational change should be systemic, collaborative, engage the heart, balance critique and positivity, use an inclusive process, temper control with letting go, happen at all levels, and involve radical breakthroughs in paradigms, beliefs, and behaviors. Well, the movement was all of these things, but again, for how many people, for how long? And so my belief, I think, is that there isn't any change that is completely transformative for everyone forever. My second slide is taken from Gail Rubin's Sexual Hierarchies, many of you know it, where societies rank people and they respond to sexual acts according to a hierarchical system of value, where people who are married, monogamous, heterosexual, reproductive, and non-commercially engaging with sex at the very top of a pyramid, and those people who, and they're rewarded with mental health, certified mental health, legality, respectability, and are seen as rights bearers and deserving of protection. And those whose sexual identities kind of transgress some of these ideas are seen as deviants, oversexed, or asexual. And these are mostly sex working, lesbian, trans, disabled women. And so one of the questions I ask of ourselves is how often in our sexual assault, violence against women movements, do we see sex workers on our posters? Do we see them at our meetings? Do we see people that represent people at the bottom of this hierarchy in our movements? Okay, next. So this is my, we know that sexual violence gets disproportionate funding and attention compared to many other women's rights issues. But how can we work on violence in a way that situates sexual violence in a continuum, in a spectrum of violence, where we also look at more mundane and equally deadly violence, those of poverty, social insecurity, and other things. And I think that we have a language of violence that we've developed, but we haven't developed a language of positive rights and sexual rights, and how do we include the work on sexual rights within the sexual violence movement. And I think theoretically, we know that sexual violence is a denial of women to say yes or no to sex. But I think we haven't figured out a way about how the denial of people's sexual well-being can be factored into our movements. And that's why I like this visual, because it is a visual against sexual violence. This is just, this is our Indian Prime Minister, who very soon after the law, after the rape, created a committee where he got citizens to contribute to a law on rape for women. And it was great, it was very inclusive. In 1 month, there was a report that was produced. But what happened is when it went into the law, they cherry-picked what they wanted. And they left out marital rape and immunity of security forces in that law. So my issue with sexual violence, and when we go to the law, is let's be careful. Let's not just go to the law because we think it's going to deliver for us what we want in terms of being inclusive of all women and all kinds of sexual acts. And I think I think that traditionally in India, the women's movement has not necessarily engaged men, but we see more and more organizations engaging men, more money flowing towards men's programs. And the anti-rape protests in India had a lot of men come out on the streets. And this was great. But on the other hand, even though there were men that came out on the streets and said, ashamed to be Indian, they also were asking for the death penalty. And there were lots of sloganeering around men saying, real masculinity does not lie in harassing women, but in protecting them. And it was a very protectionist, rhetoric. And I think that we have to kind of step away from we know men are not homogenous, so let's not talk about aggressive masculinities and the rhetoric of protection, because we're kind of going to both extremes. And we have many, many examples where resources are being shifted from very critical work on violence against women by women's groups to working with men. Thank you.